My day job is I'm Chief Technologist for Hewlett Packard Enterprise. I will talk a little bit about what Hewlett Packard Enterprise do in terms of circular economy, but I'm not here specifically to talk about that. We want to sort of talk more generally about circular economy in the IT industry. So I joined the company about a year ago. I became a Freeman this year. Excuse me. I'm also a member of the Institute for Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability. I'm a fellow with the RSA and a member of the British Computer Society, or the BCS, as we now call it. So sustainability, from my point of view, is as much a personal passion as something that I do as part of my day job. So, you know, it's something I'm very interested in, and it's why I've got involved with the IT and Climate Change Working Group at WCIT, as well as the Social Value Leadership Group, which I'm also on the steering committee for. Rich, can I hand to you?
Cool. Thanks, Russ. My name is Rich Kenny. I'm the Managing Director of Interact. We're a circular economy focused consultancy that specializes in IT performance and benchmarking. I was CTO of the Year in 2021 at the World IT Awards, beating out the CTOs of Lenovo and IBM, primarily around my work and research in circularity in the IT industry, specifically enterprise IT. I'm also a research fellow and lecturer at London South Bank University, and I've published over 10 times in the last 3 years in sort of the IEEE, ICAC, and every single time it's focused on how do we improve resource allocation and circularity with enterprise IT equipment. So that's very much me in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rich. Yes, I'm very, very honoured to have Rich with us. Rich and I kind of follow each other on LinkedIn because our sustainability interests overlap. And we got in touch a few months ago, and I just thought it'd be great to have Rich to contribute to this because he's done some great research, which is really interesting. So in terms of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to start off really sort of talking about maybe some more of the consumer side of the problem with technology, and how that's leading to e-waste. And then we're going to sort of lead into, you know, what is a circular economy, talk through some of the different options, so remanufacturing versus recycling versus refurbishment. They're subtly different, and just talking through that a little bit. Then to the point that Rich was just making about his research, he published a paper which we'll get to, but one of the topics there was, you know, are we sort of getting beyond Moore's law now, and how's that affecting the kind of power performance ratio of enterprise servers in particular, and the refresh cycles of enterprise servers. So we'll move from that consumer sort of focus. First of all, we'll get into enterprise IT, data center IT. And then maybe just a little bit of discussion about how this all kind of flows into tech for good, more of a sort of social value angle, and then sort of relating that back to maybe some of the work that the company's doing through our charities and our charity partners, through our giving back, through our pro bono work and so on, just to kind of connect it back to WCIT. And then, as I said, if people want to kind of ask questions at the end, we'll have that opportunity. And then there are some resources and further reading at the back of this, so you can follow up on some of the topics that we've talked about. Look at Rich's company's website, look at the HP website. There's the definitions about circular economy, things like that. And there's also an online e-learning course about e-waste that is really interesting. So there's plenty to do if this whets your appetite and you want to know more after the session. So I'm going to start with a poll. Basically, what I want to get a feel for is what's your attitude to technology and how often do you refresh it? The nice thing about this is that it comes up live as you do it. Very good. Okay, yeah, so we've had about 10 people have participated in that, but I think that's a really good example. We'll see if anybody else votes. But I think that's a really good number. I was expecting more people to say that they upgraded every couple of years. So I think there's definitely a generational thing here. that obviously the younger people are, the more they tend to want the latest in tech, and they'll want to upgrade as often as possible to get the latest, the fastest, the best camera, and so on. But I think people that are slightly older maybe have a slightly more kind of value for money kind of aspect to it. They'll maybe take more time. They'll be slower to select something, but when they do select it, they'll keep it for longer, which is a good thing. But obviously, I deliberately put that last point there about preferring to buy certified pre-owned, because that's what we're going to talk about. And I think in general, that's quite reflective of society at large, that it's only a very small proportion of society that would choose to buy refurbished, certified pre-owned and second-hand devices, because there is still a certain amount of stigma associated with it. So both in terms of consumer devices and also in enterprise IT. And we'll get into this as we get into the presentation, but quite often in enterprise IT, people they want to buy new because it's the financial asset. They want the best performing asset they can get for the money. They want a manufacturer's warranty and guarantee with it, and they assume that you don't get those things with the certified pre-owned or the refurbished devices. So in general, we are quite obsessed with new and shiny things. There are actually more UK mobile connections than people. And despite what we just said, 69% of mobile phone owners upgrade every 2 to 3 years. So Liz, this is for you. 10.3 connected devices per household. So that's connected devices, not just lot of electronic devices. And that number is going up all the time. So I think that's from a survey from a year or two ago by Aviva. Most houses do have at least one computer, otherwise you wouldn't be joining us today. Most have internet access these days. And from a business point of view, typically the refresh cycle is about every 3 to 5 years, and it's generally driven by finance and accounting rules on asset depreciation rather than any other sort of consideration. So what does all this mean? So who do you think the worst countries are for generating e-waste? And this is per head of population as well, which is quite significant. All right, interesting. Okay. So I suppose you probably thought I was leading you. So the worst country is actually Norway, because it's by head of population. So Norway is a very well developed country, as you probably know. It has significantly fewer people than the UK. And so that top figure in the blue is the kilotons of e-waste produced, and the lower figure is the per capita weight of e-waste produced. So in the UK, that's 23.9 kilograms per person of e-waste is produced. And because we have a much higher population than Norway, you can see how much more that means in terms of the total kilotons of e-waste that are produced from the UK. The global total is something like 61 million metric tons globally. So that table gives you the kind of league table. So you can see that it's very much dominated by European countries. And then you do have Australia and the US in there, and Japan just coming up at the bottom of the table. So obviously places that are not on there are China, Africa, South America, and so on, Russia. So we are pretty much the problem, and it's getting worse. And the prediction is that the UK will actually become the number one producer per capita globally by 2025. Okay, so we've got another quiz question for you. Here we go. So, yes, 63% of you got the right answer, which was 17.4% of global e-waste is properly processed and responsibly recycled. And that does beg the question, what happens to the rest of it? And so there, as I said at the beginning, there's a sort of consumer angle on this. And we were just talking to Liz before we started the session, and she was saying how she'd gone through this and sort of worked out how many items she has in the house. And it's more than you think. And the fact is that when we had International E-Waste Day, which was just a week or two ago, there was a big campaign to say, look, if it's got a battery or if it has a cable or if you can plug it in, then it's e-waste and you can recycle it. And that could be anything. It could be a smoke alarm, it's washing machines, it's TVs, it's computer equipment, and there's various categories of e-waste that they define. A lot of IT equipment comes under screens and monitors, for example, so laptops, tablets, and so on would come under that. Enterprise IT obviously comes under the sort of large electrical items and so on. Getting on to what is a circular economy.
So our traditional non-circular economy is what we refer to as a linear economy, and it's either take, make, or throw, or take, make, waste is basically how it works. What that assumes is that something is created, used by its first recipient, and then thrown away. That is the predominant method in a consumer economy. The reason behind that is it increases excess consumption. So rather than using things for as long as they should be used, use them as long as they're useful or wanted by you. The concept of a circular economy is that you close the loop on that. So rather than going take, make, waste, you go take, make, use, reuse, remanufacture, refurbish, reuse, then recycle. And the area of amount of waste should be very, very, very small. So if we class this as something like a mobile phone, if you want the latest and greatest, you might buy it and use it for 2 years. That phone has a viable life of 7 or 8 years easily. So what you'd find is that you might use it for 2 years and then potentially resell it to somebody else. They would then use it for a couple more years. And say during that period, they crack the screen. They would then take that to have that repaired rather than throw it away, use it for as long as they want, and pass it down the line. When I was growing up and I was the younger brother, that meant that the circular economy was in full effect when I was wearing my brother's clothes, basically. And then once I finished with them, it went to the smallest cousin. And then once the smallest cousin had finished with it, it went somewhere else. And then eventually it got cut up and used for something else. So what we used to do as an economy and as a user was use something until it was no longer usable. Make, do, and mend was a prime example. During the war, that was circular economy at its finest, where you'd use it until it's no longer even usable as the item it started out as, and then it becomes something else and is still usable. Unfortunately, what we see a lot in the circular economy is that people think recycling is circular economy. So that means that you use it, then throw it away, someone recycles it, and therefore no harm, no foul. The problem with recycling is a lot of the IT assets we make now are composites, they're amalgams of multiple other assets and other materials, and so they can't actually be recycled. The key core components, things like steel and tin and plastics, they have potential to be fairly widely recycled in most places. What a lot of these materials are made up of, though, and for example, if we take a computer or a server, it has 23 of the world's 30 most critical raw materials within it. That's things like tantalum. It's not just gold, silver, and steel. It's tantalum, it's neodymium, it's cobalt. These are crucial materials that are in very, very finite supply, very, very small supply, and primarily they're mined from unstable governmental areas. So cobalt, for example, a lot of it's from Democratic Republic of Congo, so the DRC. Large sources are from Chile as well. And the extraction mechanisms of them is quite tricky. So what you've got is this very, very precious material existing in a lot of IT that can't be recovered. And so what happens is it gets thrown away and either goes to landfill or it becomes metal waste for incineration if you can incinerate. The idea on the circular economy is you stop that waste by making it last as long as possible and therefore limit the environmental impact.
Yeah, and the other principle about circular economy is that you reuse things at the highest value that you possibly can. So that's why, recycling is better than throwing, but recycling is basically at the lowest value part of the chain. That's essentially just like what happens is that, like circuit boards will be shredded, and then various sort of methods are used to try and reclaim, some of the critical rare materials from that. But that means you're just ending up with the raw materials. And if you can prevent that from happening in the first place by reusing, by upgrading something so that it can be used for longer, which also Rich will kind of get onto in a bit.
Yeah.
So being able to reuse something means not throwing it away in the first place, repurposing it potentially, and we'll also talk about that. Remanufacture is about when you take something and you make it as good as new. So effectively, you'll get a product. It will come in a box very similar to when you buy a brand new product. It will be, it will be cleaned. It will be tested. It will have a warranty with it. It will be almost as if it was a new product, but it is remanufactured. Whereas the refurbishment is just stops a little bit short of that. It's not quite as comprehensive as remanufacturing. And then recycling is literally just shredding stuff and recovering the raw materials from it, which is the sort of lowest common denominator. And then when we asked that poll question and we said only 17.4% of e-waste, so all e-waste, all electrical equipment is responsibly recycled, despite the fact it's illegal to export e-waste to foreign countries, that's where a lot of it ends up. And so a lot of e-waste will end up in dump sites in Ghana, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, and that, because people are trying to eke out a living, they'll scavenge on those dump sites. They'll set up fires within the dump site so that they can melt the gold out of the circuit boards, and then try and get a few dollars for that gold. So we've got all of this kind of informal recycling, if you like, going on in those developing nations, which is really not what should be happening, because once you start sort of setting fires and heating circuit boards up, it's going to release a lot of the hazardous chemicals that in responsible remanufacturing or recycling would be dealt with responsibly and appropriately. And it would all be documented, and it would be all above board. So that's the issue that we've got, that because of the way that we consume technology, the way we consume electrical devices, developing nations are kind of bearing the brunt of our waste, and also they're not handling it in a safe and responsible way. It's not documented either. So we have to make kind of responsible choices. And I guess what we're trying to do with this session is kind of come at it from both a kind of consumer education point of view and also as an IT professional. Because as more and more technology becomes digital and cloud enabled, we're actually quite distanced from the materiality of the infrastructure that's powering the services that we're using. But nevertheless, it's there. So, cloud services are not virtual in the sense that they have physical material infrastructure powering them. And you have the same supply chain challenges, you have the same use of critical raw materials. And I think something that's particularly topical is generative AI, which is driving demand for GPUs, graphical processor units, like the NVIDIA chips. That's creating a massive supply chain problem globally for those chips. And we know that they depend on things like we've talked about, cobalt and some of the critical raw materials, which are a product of mining in developing nations, where we also know there are some human rights issues and so on. So there are real supply chain issues there that responsible tech companies have processes in place to make sure all of that is audited, monitored, and reported on. But that's not always the case, and not all supply chains are transparent. And so sometimes we don't actually know where materials are being sourced from, and we don't know what certain providers are doing with regards to circular economy, refurbishing, remanufacturing, and reducing the reliance on virgin raw materials.
It's worth talking about while we're just on circular economy as well, is that the reason circular economy is so valuable as opposed to recycling is that most of the metals and materials that exist within e-waste are in such finite supply because they're used primarily through renewable sources for when it's creating energy. So a lot of our adjustment to climate change, this approach to 1.5 degrees that we need to get to the Paris Accord, a lot of the pathways to get us nearer to that decarbonisation relies on those sort of materials like copper, like neodymium, like tantalum. These sort of these critical raw materials, they're needed for solar panels, they're needed for wind turbines, they're needed for lithium batteries for EVs and things. So every time we waste them, we waste an opportunity to help decarbonize the energy in our grid as well. So a good example is that to completely provide the energy for the UK EV transition would require the entire world's supply of copper every single year. So if we were to go with a fully renewable energy grid powered by the solar or wind, it would require all the world's supply of copper every single year going forward to maintain that level of renewable. So access to these materials is very, very crucial in how we decarbonize as a world as well. So this whole piece of throwing it away becomes much more painful. And you think there's not just a social impact, which is exactly what Russell's talking about, where the e-waste ends up, what that has impacts on communities, the people who actually pay the environmental pain of the benefit we get from using the product. But the actual materials in and of themselves are crucial for our future. And circular economy buys us that time to find other alternatives. The whole value of circular economy is that by reducing and eliminating use cycles and eliminating waste, we're fundamentally securing an opportunity to help our world develop going forward as well. And the only way we can actually get to where we need to in the future is through better mineral usage. And circular economy is such a massive part of that.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So just wanted to say, just while Rich was talking, and we were sort of getting on to critical raw materials and so on. So another model is called donut economics. This is by a lady called Kate Raworth. She's an economist. She's Sophie Raworth's sister, if you know the newsreader on Sophie Raworth. But she's come up with this model, and it's obviously called donut economics because you have this inner and outer boundaries, and it's talking about living within planetary limits. So the inner boundary is like the minimum that we need as human beings to survive. And the outer boundary are the planetary limits that we have to live within because there are finite resources, as Rich mentioned. And that's kind of divided up into these areas here, which kind of align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals as well, of which there are 17, but there's only 12 there in the picture. So you've got things like, fresh water, ocean acidification, air pollution, biodiversity loss. So, when we talk about sustainability and climate change, we inevitably focus on greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide equivalent, and that tends in the IT industry to come from power consumption, but there are all these other kind of aspects as well, and particularly when we think about data centers and water consumption, for example, and we're hearing lots about data centers being built in water constrained areas, and we know that lots of even developed countries like the UK are going to suffer water scarcity within the next 5 years or so. So we have to kind of bear this in mind. How do we kind of fit our insatiable demand for technology, for digital services, for data? So the global data sphere is doubling every 4 years. So every 4 years we create as much information as we've ever created before. And that's just exponentially growing. It's all got to be stored somewhere. It's all got to be processed somewhere. And so that's driving demand for data centers, cloud data centers, and so on. And in turn, data centers are putting strains on natural resources like water supply, energy supply, and land availability, and so on. So I think, as a group, if we're focused on IT and climate change, we also have to be looking at this broader picture because it's all related, it's all intersectional, and you can't just look at greenhouse gases in separation from all of the rest of this as well. But the donut economics model, we're not going to get into like the detail on how you apply this and how you use it, but we've got a list of references at the back that we'll send out, we'll share with you. And if you want to find out more about donut economics, you can do. And Rich, you've used this with your own company, haven't you, Interact, before?
Yeah. Yeah, so we align. There's an aspect of donut economics that involves what's called planetary boundaries, which you can see on the right of there. Those planetary boundaries are fundamentally the mechanisms that we need to have a world that works. And as Russ talk about it, it's made up of what you can see on the outside. I'm not going to talk you through it. We're exceeding 7 of those 9 planetary boundaries right now. And the problem we've got is that most of our conversations around climate and planet are reduced to carbon because it's reporting has always been aligned to economic benefit. And the nearest we can find to economic benefit that seems to be transferable in the accounting sphere is carbon or CO2 equivalent. So what we tend to find is all conversations around sustainability and climate change are framed in the sphere of carbon. Whereas actually we need to look a lot more about biodiversity, air pollution, chemical pollution, and acidification, things like that. And we build all that into what we do at Interact so that when you understand when you make a decision, you should understand what that decision impacts. And so the main thing we look at is how do you provide transparency and help someone make better decisions by providing the right amount of information to make those choices. Because it can be very reductive, and we see this with cloud, exactly what Russ talked about earlier on, where cloud people say with cloud, cloud's really sustainable. It's really low energy. It's zero carbon. It's it's scope 3 as opposed to scope 2. And you say, okay, but what other impacts are there of the people that are serving that compute? And it comes down to things like fresh water, like biodiversity impacts by having large data centers in arid regions. The use of offsets as opposed to carbon reduction technologies, available utilization and resource use. You need to look at the whole picture in order to make a good decision. And that's very much what donut economics and planetary boundaries are about. And that's what I'm hoping by the end of this session, everyone will have a better understanding of what outputs they're generating and what it takes to get that way. So whether it's metals, whether it's land use, whether it's acidification, whether it's carbon, you'll be better prepared to make good planetary decisions, and that's really important.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rich. So just to this question then, it's popped up saying, how do I recycle mobiles and laptops? Because I'm never sure that I've erased personal data. So I think this is a really important point. I've actually got a bag of hard drives in the corner of my office that I haven't recycled because of the same concern. So there are a number of different ways to do this. So where we started talking very broadly about e-waste in very general terms, which could be anything, fridge freezers, TVs, smoke alarms. If you look on your local authority website, they should have some information about WEEE recycling, so WEEE, which is the waste electrical and electronic scheme. So that's really sort of almost like responsible disposal. So rather than throwing things away, you would look for WEEE recycling in your area. And so, for example, my local authority will collect small domestic appliances from the curbside with the garbage removal. So whenever you put your bins out for that, they'll pick up your old toaster or whatever if you leave it next to your bin. But also, I think because we're talking about circular economy, I've put some information in there about recycle your electricals. So that's from Material Focus. So there are places that you can donate your old electrical items, but also usually with things that aren't too old, there's a commercial value in them. So there are plenty, hundreds of companies who will buy used mobile phones, used laptops, used computers from you. And there are even comparison sites that you can go on, which will tell you who will give you the best deal for any given device. So they're worth checking out. And then sites like Back Market as well, which you might have seen on TV recently, advertising, really trying to kind of break the stigma that we referred to earlier about recycled devices. Actually, the TV ad's really good because it's kind of challenging that kind of sheep mentality of, I need to have the latest device because everybody's got one. And it's kind of saying, no, you actually need to think more sustainably, more responsibly. And if you could just get a refurbished one, wouldn't that be just as good most of the time? And so they're a real kind of retailer of refurbished tech and trying to really make it acceptable from a consumer point of view, which I think is great. So just a little word on, we've been talking a lot about two different types of e-waste, really. So if we think about IT specifically and not just e-waste generally, electrical items, generally speaking, we've got consumer IT and we've got business IT. They are different and they have different characteristics. So typically consumer IT, consumer products, they're designed to be ergonomic. So in other words, they feel good, they fit in your hand, or they're designed, to be used easily. Quite often that feeds into the fact that they need to be lightweight, they need to look good. Sometimes that's a priority over other factors. So if you think about, iPhones, iPads, MacBooks, MacBooks engineered out of a single piece of aluminium, so it looks sleek and, well engineered. And that's very appealing to a lot of people. It's also lightweight because it's aluminium. But with things like, iPhones, iPads, not wishing to single them out, but they are particularly bad at this, is that because they're engineered for cost, they are quite often single board devices. And if they're not single board devices, they're kind of, they're put together in a way that doesn't promote repair. And so I'll give you an example that my partner bought an iPad Pro, so over £1,000 worth of stuff, dropped it in the bath in the first week of having it, pulled it out as quickly as she could. It sort of survived, but a couple of things weren't quite working quite as well as they should have been. So I think one of the cameras stopped working. There were some other things that were a bit problematic. And we took it to one of these repair shops and they said, well, to open it up, there's a risk because the motherboard's bonded to the screen. We have to pull them apart and there's a risk that the screen will crack. And if the screen cracks, it will cost £500 to replace. If the motherboard breaks, it will cost £750 to replace. So you've got this thing where sometimes the spare parts actually cost more than just buying a new device. And that's why quite a lot of people, when they dropped iPhones and the screens cracked, you see some people who've kept their iPhones with all the cracks on the screen, but the corollary is a lot of people just replace the phone. And then, what happens to those phones? So they are difficult to repair. They're often, you can't repair them yourself. Sometimes you need specialist tools, or you can only buy the parts if you're an authorized repairer. And we've seen with like the latest iPhone models, again, not wishing to pick on Apple, but they serialize all of the components and they have software serialization. So if you put a third-party OEM part into your new iPhone, it won't work. So even if it's perfectly usable, for instance, a camera component, Apple have put software serialization into all of those hardware parts. So if the serial number doesn't match up, it won't operate. And I think we've heard a lot also about right to repair in the US. People being able to sort of take your phone anywhere, so you don't have to take it back to the manufacturer. You could take it to any repair shop. They should be able to fix it for you. So obviously the more accessible repairs are and the more cost-effective repairs are, the more likely people are going to be to do that. But if there are barriers to self-repair, people will just throw devices away or keep them in a drawer and get a new one. And that's what, kind of creates this e-waste problem as well. So the other thing about consumer devices is they are almost always battery powered, they use direct current. So it's very low levels, 5 volt, less than 12 volts certainly. And that means that their lifetime energy use is comparatively low. So you are plugging chargers into the mains. They have transformers. There's some waste energy from the transformer process. But in general, your device is being powered all day from that couple of hours charge. So your grid consumption for powering consumer devices is relatively low. So by contrast, enterprise IT devices are designed to be high performance, used 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They need to be reliable. They're designed for longevity and reuse. They're also highly customizable in general. So customers can say, I want this amount of memory, I want these drives, I want these processors. There's lots of kind of plug and play in the design. And that means that when it comes to reusing or remanufacturing or recycling, that plug and play can work to the advantage. So, things that hard drives being a great example, you can swap out magnetic hard drives for flash drives. You can swap out, slow memory for a fast memory, and so on. They're also generally designed to be engineer serviceable, which quite often means that they can be user serviceable as well. And we're seeing that more and more. So at HPE, where I work, there's more and more customers can replace the parts that we send out. We don't necessarily need to send an engineer anymore, because the design of the product, so even if the power supply fails, it's a modular power supply. The customer can just pull out the old one, push in the new one, they're done. Doesn't need an engineer, doesn't need, lots of downtime. But by contrast, they are AC powered, so 240 to 400 volts AC, and they're powered on all the time, pretty much. So what you get is that the energy use through their lifetime is relatively high. So when we're thinking about sustainability, when we're thinking about when to, refresh equipment, this is part of the factor. Now, obviously varies. That depends on, where you are in the world, what the energy mix of the grid is, and therefore what the carbon emissions associated with powering that device are, is quite variable. But when you look at product carbon footprint data sheets, if you look at, let's just say, a Dell laptop, 80% of the carbon footprint will be embodied carbon from the manufacture and supply chain process, and about 20% from lifetime energy use. Whereas an HPE server would be 18% embodied and 82% lifetime energy use. But as I say, that's based on some assumptions about the grid carbon factor that's used throughout the lifetime. So if you're lucky enough to be using it in Iceland, the south of Scotland, or places with lots of renewable energy, then the product carbon footprint from your use of the product will be significantly less. But product carbon footprint data sheets are based on global averages. So, okay. So yeah, just I've got this pretty much this one slide on Hewlett Packard Enterprise. So one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk is because Hewlett Packard Enterprise has it operates two technology renewal centers. One is in Andover, Massachusetts, which is near Boston. And the other one is in Erskine in Scotland, which used to be the Digital manufacturing plant. And Digital were acquired by Compaq, Compaq were acquired by HP, and HP became HPE. So we've retained that facility because it was enormous. It has a huge square footage. And so that gives us a great facility. It was also because it was a manufacturing facility, it has all of the equipment, the warehousing, the production lines, and everything else that mean we can do remanufacturing properly. So between the two technology renewal centers that we have, they receive between 3 and 4 million IT assets a year. I've got a question coming up about how successful the remanufacturing process is. I won't tell you just yet. But the idea is that everything we take in, we also take in equipment from any manufacturer. So it doesn't have to be Hewlett Packard Enterprise equipment. Quite often it is, because it's end of lease, or it's end of short-term rental, or it's a demo kit that's coming back. But it all goes through a rigorous process where everything is tracked from the moment it arrives to the moment it leaves again. We produce reports for customers that say, this is what happened to all of your devices that you sent us. So, we could get 10,000 Dell laptops, as well as all of their servers from the data center. In each case, we'll document what happens to that laptop, how many of them were remanufactured, how many were recycled. And then that gives the customer some figures that they can use for their own sort of carbon reporting about carbon emissions avoided due to landfill diversion, or carbon emissions avoided because of use of refurbished and certified pre-owned equipment, and so on. And so we have warehousing facilities here in Erskine. So all of these certified pre-owned equipment. So if it was a Hewlett Packard Enterprise product, it will be remanufactured and then resold as a certified pre-owned product. complete with the warranty that you'd expect to get from us. And obviously, if anything goes wrong with it, it will be, maintained, parts will be replaced, and so on. So I think it's a great story for the UK that we've got, basically one of the biggest technology renewal centres in the world. Well, the two centres are the biggest technology renewal centres in the world that are owned by a manufacturer. So Erskine's kind of like number 2 in the world. And we've got a lot of people there that just love working there because they've been working with technology for maybe 20, 25 years. And we remanufacture products from 18 months old to 25 years old. So in a lot of cases, there was a great story about NASA needing an HP server. So HP, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, has existed since 2015 when we split from HP. But obviously there's servers that are older than that, and NASA wanted like an A-class server from the HP days. Couldn't find the parts, couldn't maintain the server they had, and they were able to source basically a 20-year-old but effectively brand new server from our technology renewal center, which enabled them to keep that particular project running for longer. And that's pretty common. So we see that, surprisingly, there's still plenty of systems in the world that rely on technology that's 20, 30, 40 years old. And customers are sometimes going on eBay to get spare parts, from old equipment that's being sold on there. So this is kind of like, eBay, but, as a manufacturer, we're taking in products, we're remanufacturing them, and then we're selling them on. In the case of the products that are not Hewlett-Packard Enterprise products, we sell them to wholesalers, and then those wholesalers will sell them on to a second market. But obviously, because we accept products up to 25 years old, quite often we're getting things back, 3 or 4 times during their lifetime. So it's a kind of great story that we've got that capability within the UK. So we've got a question about growth and pushing EV. Is this a circular economy model that really will be better? So I'll have a go at answering that. Now I'm going to give Rich a go as well. So I think probably because when Rich was talking about critical earth materials, you probably thought about EVs, and it's a good thought. So obviously we've seen EVs are pushing up demand for batteries. We want bigger batteries all the time. We're looking at different chemistry for batteries. So you've got the classic kind of lithium-ion batteries. There's a lot of battery sort of designs that have got cobalt in them, but now they're sort of diverting away from that as well. So lithium is kind of like actually one of the most plentiful minerals in the world, but it just depends where you get it from and how you get it. So there's even talk about a lithium mine being set up in Cornwall, where they used to do tin mining and so on. So that's potentially a more sustainable source of lithium for the UK battery market. But I think I had a Tesla Model S, for a few years, and I was used to people sort of poking me about sustainability of batteries and electric vehicles. I think sometimes you've got to sort of consider the broader question. So cobalt, one of the major uses of cobalt in the world is for oil refining. So more cobalt is used for oil refining than for electric vehicle batteries. So we always kind of have to look at things like in the global context and say, sometimes it's a case of we're moving to something that is better than what we've got, but we do have to be conscious about the demand on what are in effect limited raw materials. And so something that I've been really sort of pleased to see is a growth in battery recycling technology. And a number of plants that have been set up. There's one in Germany, where they'll take in batteries of all different types, and they've got all the facilities to make sure that it's done properly. But there's even a system where they can completely shred the battery and recover all of the critical raw materials from it quite successfully. And so we need to push for those. So I think it's a good question, but we also need to be pushing for circular economy in the battery industry, and we're already seeing some of that happening. Rich, what's your view?
Yeah, I think my number one issue with EVs is that the UK grid can't support, from an infrastructure point of view, an electronic fleet. So if we were to, we've got something like a 2030 or 2035 deadline to say that everyone's going to have to be an electronic vehicle by then. We don't have enough grid capacity in the UK, and we've certainly not got the investment in infrastructure to make that remotely possible. So even if we could move everyone to an EV from a capacity point of view, we can't from a physical infrastructure point of view. This is kind of exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about not having a joint or life cycle approach to deciding a decision. So the reason the EV thing moved ahead so quickly was because it was carbon is bad, therefore petrol is bad, therefore petrol vehicles are bad. And electricity is good because it's lower carbon, therefore electricity is good, without looking at exactly everything that Russ talked about, as in the extending life cycle of existing petrol and diesel cars, for example. Like, for me, I'd want to know from a circular economy point of view, at what point is a electric car better than a currently produced car? Because we know that the creation of an electronic vehicle is more mineral and carbon intensive than a petrol vehicle. Now, it doesn't mean that it's a worse thing. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. We can't have binary discussions around good and bad. We have to have levels of that. So I think the thing I saw recently was your average EV, it takes 20,000 miles before it balances from an embodied point of view, from a diesel car or a petrol car versus an electronic car. So if you have an EV, it needs to do 20,000 miles before it becomes a zero carbon embodied purchase, which isn't very much. 20,000 miles isn't a great deal, is it? I mean, I think that's a relatively small amount. Whereas I had heard in some research it was as much as 80,000, which then becomes a big problem. But as we get the technology better, that number goes down.
Yeah.
So I think what we've done is we've probably jumped the gun on EV, if I'm honest, because we haven't created a circular economy for the components, for the car itself, for the batteries. We don't have that ready yet in the same way that we do for other vehicles. And we don't have the infrastructure ready. So I think we've gone too fast on it personally. I think it's probably the right approach, but my view would always be, like in a circular economy, reduce and reuse first. So I think a better mechanism would be more incentive around car sharing, for example, or focusing on commercial fleet ahead of domestic and commuter fleet, for example. Areas where we know that trucks are going to do 300,000 miles, we should be focused on making them the most effective EVs they possibly can be, and in putting smart technology in there to reduce wastage on the actual journey. So things like that. So my view is very much that you can look at a problem and solve it two different ways, but should you actually be solving that problem is always the question I would be raising. And I think EVs have become this very polarizing conversation that you can't do good for doing bad, if that makes sense. So it's how do you do less harm? And I think the approach we've got from a governmental point of view is not quite right.
Yeah, no, and I kind of agree with all of that, even though I was an EV owner. I think there's probably a feeling amongst early adopters of EVs that we were sort of trying to be kind of pioneers and lead the way. But you're right. I mean, how you scale it, it requires government action. The National Grid have done sort of studies into this, and there's a lot of upgrade work required. It's also why we have such disparity in grid carbon factors across the National Grid, which is split into about 20 different regions.
Yep.
And why I get bent out of shape at people that talk about, 100% renewable energy for data centers in Slough, when they're actually, what they've done is they've bought Scottish Power's output from a wind farm in Scotland, and the National Grid isn't capable of transferring that renewable energy from Scotland to Slough. So it's not true, right? You're not consuming renewable energy. You're buying renewable energy,
yeah,
which is good, but you're not consuming it at the point where the actual, IT is located. And renewable energy doesn't have a negative carbon effect. So if it's 225 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour in Slough, and let's say it's 11 in the south of Scotland, then that's 236 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. But arguably, divide by 2, get the average. It's better than it was.
Yeah.
But yeah, once the grid capacity is improved, we'll be able to better balance the grid between supply and demand. There's lots of I've got a Tesla Powerwall in the house with solar PV, so I could charge my battery during the day from solar, charge my car from the battery at night, and not rely on the grid. And also, I can export that renewable energy to the grid for other people that want to use it. So there's all that kind of demand sharing, load balancing stuff that needs to happen. But I think, Rich, you're right. There's no quick fix here. And I also think, certainly if you talk to the Green Party, they'll just say, well, we're too reliant on personal transportation as a nation. And that's systemic. So it's not like, we've gone down, we have a van, we have a camper van, right, which we generally just go away in for leisure. And we've done 2,500 miles in a year in our camper van. It's the only vehicle we've got. But if you can't get public transport, if you can't get about and do the things you need to do, the fallback position will always be, well, I need a car to do those things. And we're kind of seeing that with the ultra low emission zone in London and how that's affecting people as we get further out, because they've become accustomed to having a car, even though they're so close to London. So there's lots of factors here. But I think, having that circular economy thinking rather than the linear economy thinking, which is just let's just make stuff that people want and let's not worry about what happens to it. And I think also with conventional vehicles, we don't have a circular economy. It just so happens that so much of commercial vehicles are made of metal that they have a commercial value just by existing. And so they're not going through like a remanufacturing process like we're talking about here with IT. They're literally just being melted down for scrap metal. Once they've been sort of scavenged for parts that people might want, ultimately they'll just get crushed and melted. So that's not a circular economy. That's just waste disposal and recycling, right, of the raw materials. So I did mention about the circular economy report. So that's something that we provide with our customers at HPE. And you can see, like in the top left corner, we sort of say, well, here's how many, the proportion of your devices, not all devices, but specifically the ones that you sent us, here's what we did with them. And then we can sort of project from that, here's how much metal was recovered, or here's how much energy potentially was saved, the waste kept from landfill, and so on. And then there's various sort of methodologies that we cover, depending on what the customer's reporting is for sustainability, in terms of how that might flow into their own sort of sustainability reporting. But the important thing is that if you're a company and you're getting into IT asset disposal, as they call it, ITAD, make sure you're working with a partner that gives you complete traceability and transparency of what's happening to the assets. And I think going back to the earlier question about mobile phone and laptop recycling and data, responsible recyclers will also give you a certificate of destruction. So preferably what they do is they do secure erasure, and they will give you a certificate that says they've securely erased your data. And that's done to kind of military spec, data can never be recovered type standards. And that's what that certificate attests for you, is that so whether that's degaussing of hard drives or just, software erasure that is multiple times basically, so there's no residual data left on the drive because it's been overwritten millions of times. What we see, particularly as I work in public sector customers, they tend to physically destroy the hard drives to put data beyond the reach of anybody and take all the risk out of it. But there's a massive sustainability impact if you are drilling and shredding every hard drive that you've ever owned. And so from an HP point of view, we're getting, empty SAN arrays back in our technology renewal center, which then we've just got to repopulate with disks in order for that to be reused. So that's just another example of, maybe kind of security and risk management versus sustainability, recycling. Interesting kind of trade-off. Okay, quiz part 2. So I didn't mention it, but what percentage of IT assets that we receive at HP's Technology Renewal Centres were remanufactured in 2022? Was it 90%, 82%, 64%, or 47%? So that's quite evenly split, isn't it? So yeah, 82% is the answer. Over the last few years, it's basically it's between 80 and 90%, and it just depends on the mix of products that we receive. So the more iPads and laptops we get, then the less likely we are to completely be able to remanufacture those. So our server remanufacture rate is 93%, but that average comes down because of, like I say, if we get iPads with Find My iPhone enabled, they just get shredded. There's nothing you can do with them. They're completely locked out. And similarly, because they're single board devices, so Chromebooks, classic example, very low value kind of laptop that is designed to fail after 5 years and is a single board device. So it generally ends up getting recycled. So that's another example of where different manufacturers have got different design criteria. So, you'll find the enterprise IT manufacturers like HPE, Lenovo, Dell, and others will design products so that they can be remanufactured. And that's a very important point. And particularly with HPE, because we operate that circular economy and we have these technology renewal centers that we operate ourselves, we want that job of remanufacturing to be as easy as possible. So we design the products with that in mind from the outset. And we sort of make freely available online for any kind of remanufacturer or recycling partner to use all of our materiality, all of our parts lists, and how to disassemble the products and break them down into their component parts to maximize reuse and replacement. Okay, so Rich, over to you on server refresh cycles of enterprise IT.
Thank you very much. So what we can see here is a snippet of paper my team wrote in the IEEE Journal of Sustainable Computing. It was the first time we published on this one. We were the first people to identify the point where Moore's law had stopped. So if you don't know, Moore's law is the fundamental law of computing that says every 2 years a system or CPU chip will either halve in size or double in performance. So Moore's law was what was driving refresh cycles for enterprise IT and for general IT refresh cycles, laptop, desktops, things like that. It basically meant that every 2 years you were doubling the energy efficiency of your asset. And Moore's law kicked in around about 1970, officially when we talk about CPUs, and it finished in 2014, which kind of nobody seemed to have noticed at the time. So it happened because we were running some research into understanding the impact of refurbished technology and does it actually decrease in performance as you refurbish it? So exactly what Russell's talking about. When you remanufacture equipment, there was this weird concept that by refurbishing equipment, it became worse. It was a less effective asset. It was not as good as a brand new one. So we started by benchmarking loads and loads and loads of IT servers and trying to find out if replacing a brand new part with a refurbished part, did it decrease the performance of the asset? And it didn't. There was no difference between a brand new asset that had just come out of the box versus an asset used for 3 years, refurbished to factory condition standards, and then run again. So things that wear from a mechanical point of view, and this is where the concept of refurbishment came from, is that as you use something, the concept is that it wears away, it becomes less good. And that's been driven by things like agriculture. So if you have a tractor and you drive your engine, what happens? There's elements of friction, there's elements of movement. And what happens therefore is the asset wears, it has wear and tear, and there's physical degradation. And that's true for mechanical components that move, but it's not true for IT. The more you use IT, it doesn't become less effective. There's certain aspects where heat causes issues, or if there's moving parts like on a hard drive or a power supply, they can wear, but they're very small parts of the IT asset. So things like the CPU, the RAM, NAND-based storage, for example, these things don't actually degrade over time in the same way. So this piece of research we carried out with Innovate UK, University of East London, we were testing to see what happened. And as we were testing, we ended up benchmarking more IT servers than the world had done to that point. So every major manufacturer between them had done about 900 IT benchmarks. We've done over 15,000 now. So between every HP, Cisco, Dell, Lenovo, IBM, between them, we've done 15 times more IT benchmarks than they've done. What that means is we've got this massive data set with which to look at what's happening generationally to CPUs. And we identified that in 2014, that transformational change of Moore's law stopped happening with CPUs. They became incrementally effective rather than transformationally efficient. The reason that was such big news for the IT industry is you have a 3-year refresh cycle. That's the standard. You have a 3-year warranty, use it for 3 years, get rid of it, because by the time you've used it for 3 years, you've hit either one or even two refresh cycles on the asset. So you're always going to win on the energy efficiency versus the cost. That was the dogma. In 2014, that wasn't true anymore. What that means is it kind of turned the IT industry on its head a little bit by saying, why are you now replacing every 3 years? And the answer would be, well, because we've written the asset off economically, or because we've got a 3-year warranty. None of that has anything to do with the capability or performance of the asset. So this slowdown in Moore's law has allowed things like circular economy, like refurbishment, like remanufacture to have a really, really strong case now in all verticals and all businesses that are using IT. So a good example of how this has had an impact recently is Google have just changed its product life cycle on its servers from 4 years to 6 years. So now rather than refreshing or upgrading their servers every 4 years, they do it every 6 years. That saved them £2.9 billion this year in cost. So when you've got people like Google, like Amazon, like Apple looking at this and going, how do we make the most of this? And they'll tout it as an environmental win because it is a huge environmental win. By extending the product life, they're decreasing the impact of embodied carbon versus used carbon. It is definitely saving tons and tons, megatons of carbon. But from an economic point of view, there's a huge benefit to product life extension. And that's what we do. We help identify where product life extension takes place in data centers. The reason this is really important is because it also means you can refigure your components as you remanufacture, as you refurbish, to make generational leaps in efficiency at the same time as not having to buy a brand new asset. So as a business, we've done this 400 times in the last 2.5 years for data centers. So I've done 400 data centers. On average, we reduce their energy consumption by 70%. Now, these are huge energy users. These are guys who's using multiple megawatts of energy every year. And we reduce the impact of their serving of compute by 70% in most cases. The worst is 56%. The best I've done is 93%. And that's entirely through looking at the capability of the assets and then deciding what projects to undertake. And in nearly every single project, it's identifying what should fit product life extension. So which assets should not be getting thrown away, but should be getting either reconfigured, reused, re-identified. And at the other end of the spectrum, which assets should be getting removed as soon as possible because they aren't part of that generation that hasn't had that benefit. So one I looked at recently for a major national bank, they were looking at getting rid of 2,500 of the same server, or in their eyes, the same server. They bought it at the same time. The variation in efficiency because of the components between their best and their worst servers within that estate was 370% difference. Now they see it as the same asset. It's a Gen 9 asset. It's a 2014 to 2016 server. They grade them, well, we grade them from A to F on energy efficiency. And what we would see then is that they had A's, which were more performant than things they were just buying. So servers they were just buying from the manufacturer that year were less energy efficient than some of the configurations they had from 7 years ago. The reason behind that is the interplay between cores, frequency, memory configurations. There's a huge amount of complexity goes into this, and we try and simplify that. The key thing is that in each of these cases, the only reason most of these businesses are carrying out refreshes is because of accounting, not because of performance and not because of environmental concerns. So they're saying we've MRI'd it over 4 years. That's what we've done. Therefore, it's time to go. Or there is no warranty for this asset because it's been 3 years. So we have to get rid of it. And this is about providing that transparency and saying risk plays a role, performance plays a role, but 99% of the time, it's traditional dogmatic approaches to IT that drive procurement. And what we want to try and do is provide a new way of looking at your IT, of going, why don't we look at how good it is at doing its job? And that can be the only criteria. And that's why remanufacture is so important, refurbished is so important, because these assets are as good as the brand new version. It's like what Russell was saying along with NASA. They're buying a server that's 20 years old, but it's pretty much the set as good as the day it came out of the box. Now, it could be outperformed by newer equipment for sure, but it isn't any worse than the day it was bought the first time.
Hmm.
And that's what this is about. It's about understanding the variation between assets and what that looks like, and why are you not doing product life extension in all your businesses with all your IT? Because this is the next stage in low hanging fruit for all businesses to win from a cost and an environmental point of view, is to understand what assets can last longer and how they match them. With laptops, a good example of this would be matching your current estate to your user profiles. So 99% of your estate are probably not due an upgrade after 3 years because they're not using any amount of the capacity of the capability of that unit. They're using Word, they're using Excel, they're using basic web browsing. 1% of your power users is driving your procurement because you're saying it's 3 years, it's a 3-year lease, get rid of the equipment. It's 3 years, we bought after 3 years, let's get another set of stuff in. Whereas actually, if I looked at it, they're probably using it 30 to 40%. The key is understanding how much IT has evolved in the last 5 years versus what it's done year on year before that. And looking at how do we purchase better, how do we extend better, and how do we match capability to its point in the product life cycle. And Russell and I were talking about this before about saying your product life extension on an asset. Today's production server is today's database server is tomorrow's test and dev server. Yeah. And it's 3 years time after that, it's it's going to run the web server, it's going to run things like that. It's matching the asset performance to each level of its lifestyle and life cycle and understanding how it still fits. So it's not just going buy new because I need the best performance. Chances are you don't need the best performance. Chances are that 5% of your estate requires that level of performance. So you should be buying brand new to make those benefits. But 95% of your estate can probably sequentially move down in regards to your assets. And then at the very bottom, identify the ones that are serving no purpose now and get rid of them immediately. Because the second the asset isn't serving the purpose, that's when it needs to then be either remanufactured and upgraded in some way, or it needs to be removed and recycled effectively to reclaim as much of the materials as you can. That's very much what this is about.
So a question just came through there. Well, two questions from Paul and Julie. So one was about, server tech refresh makes sense, but personal laptops run out of space because of huge growth in software size. So that's the first point. Second point, are companies listening and driving product longevity through the mechanisms you've defined?
So they're starting to listen now from a company's point of view. The companies are starting to listen now because most of the main providers now are seeing that there's environmental benefits carrying out product life extension. So in a lot of cases, I deal with a lot of financial institutions. They want to do this, but as far as they're concerned, an asset has no value after 4 years because they've already written it off. So from their point of view, if they don't spend budget increasing their IT estate, then they lose that budget. So they don't see they see economics as the only driver for value. And that's what we're trying to educate the whole market around is economics are one part of it, environmental impact's another. And if you looked at the environmental impact of product life extension, it far outweighs buying new stuff. But if you can then use that as a lever to pull, you can make huge cost savings. Because this is one of those things where it's not a zero-sum game. Product life extension is a win-win-win. The business wins from a financial point of view. The environment wins from an environmental point of view. Like no one actually has a negative experience from this, and companies are waking up to that now. And I think a big driver will be changes in legislation that are coming right now that will force people to have to start reporting more granularly on their carbon, and therefore you're going to have to provide a reason as why you threw out 20,000 completely effective laptops for no other reason than because accounts told you they don't have to pay for them anymore. So when there becomes a carbon conversation or an embodied carbon or biodiversity conversation, I think we'll see this go from being the trailblazers doing the right things to every company going, why have we not been doing this for 10 years? And I had a really good chat with a council yesterday where they came and spoke to us and said, what are you doing around this? What can we do from an IT point of view to get maximum value for our customers? And the council sees that as service valuation for people in their constituent areas. I said, what are you doing on product life extension? And they said, well, nothing. We just replace every 3 years. I said, well, that's your first one to look at. Understand why you're replacing, come back to me with a reason why you're replacing, and I will save you one refresh cycle today that will give you millions more to invest in your IT transformation. And when people start carrying out these actions and seeing that it's had not only zero negative impact, but a huge positive impact, I think we'll see this become the de facto norm. And then, all it takes is them looking at that going, well, if Google can do it for GCP, I can probably do it in my county council. So that's the big one for me, I think. What was the other question? Sorry.
The other question is just an observation that the principle works great for enterprise IT and servers, but sometimes the problem with personal laptops is that they just effectively become redundant due to the growing demand of software. So both in terms of processor power and disk space in particular, growth in software size, that sort of thing. I think so yeah, very valid point. And I think there's a whole other kind of discipline here around green software as well. So there is that factor that software always will become more sophisticated to take up the available resources, and with cloud computing, almost there's that kind of culture that resources are infinite and you can just use as much as you need. But yeah, it all has an impact. So we've all seen that with mobile phones slowing down. That's why I had the question at the front, when do you upgrade? Is it when things start to slow down? Because that's quite common. But the reason they're slowing down isn't necessarily because your laptop's not any good anymore. It can be like inefficient coding. And so, for the software community, the problem is that efficient coding takes a lot longer to do. So if you're using cloud and a cloud resources are infinite, you can basically do lazy coding and you don't have to worry about efficiency. Whereas some of us who've been around for a while probably remember having to fit code into 8, 16 or 32K, and having to, part of the joy of programming was kind of really working out how you could be as efficient as possible with very limited constrained resources. But obviously that's been flipped in its head now, and so resources are no barrier. So you can just make very kind of monolithic, inefficient software. And then from a consumer point of view, it's then down to the end user device, then has to be upgraded to match that very resource hungry software. So we're going to have to change that as well. And that's the Green Software Foundation. I've got a lot of guidance on architectural patterns, how you can measure, the efficiency of your software and so on. And it's one of the efficiency principles that we would use at Hewlett Packard Enterprise as well. So we talk a lot about electrical efficiency, and that's like the power performance factor, and how do you tackle over provisioning and underutilization in hardware. But you have to look, at higher levels of the stack. If you're using Python, it's the most inefficient software language, but it's increasingly popular due to the rise of AI, advanced analytics. Whereas if you're using C or Rust, highly efficient languages. And that's because C and Rust are more like machine code, and Python's a much higher level language that's much more kind of human friendly than it is machine friendly. So it takes more compute cycles to interpret and process than lower level languages do. But naturally, programmers don't want to use lower level languages because it puts a lot of work on the programmer to translate business requirements into what is effectively machine code, rather than just being able to do something that's, Python's sort of generally used for experimentation with data, and that's probably fine. But it does have, quite a high computational impact. And we just got to take all that into account when we're thinking about IT efficiency and IT sustainability.
I would say on the laptop side of things, though, like if storage is an issue, realistically, you're probably looking more at like using burst out to cloud for storage, or to have compute applications carried out on localized cloud. So the hybridization of an estate is exactly the same for a laptop as it is for data center. In my view, I use machine learning. I write machine learning code, and I'm writing on a 9-year-old laptop. And we've got one of the fastest, most performant applications on the planet, but the laptop's not the constraint.
Yeah.
It's you know what I mean? It's very much the human.
Just wanted to very briefly cover this off. So I think, part of the circular aspect of circular economy is that kind of remanufacturing and refurbishing of IT rather than recycling, it puts affordable technology in the hands of people who are a lot more price sensitive. And so thinking about things like digital inclusion. One of the charity partners, WCIT charity partners, was Thames Reach for a number of years, who focused on digital inclusion for people who are homeless or at risk of being homeless because of the need for IT to apply for bank accounts, apply for benefits and so on, and get yourself back into society. So really important, relied on donations of, used equipment. But obviously, education, charities, non-profits, social enterprise, and so on also kind of increasingly need digital technology that relies on IT, but they haven't got the means to buy the latest and greatest of IT in all cases. So these kind of second markets for what are quality products that come with a warranty and are as good as new, but are cheaper, and just because they're not the latest and greatest, is a great opportunity, and also supporting small businesses and founders, and dealing with things like economic inequalities in startups and businesses. So it's got quite wide-reaching consequences when we think about completing the circle and getting away from the people who've got the money, can afford to buy the latest and greatest, and throw it away without caring what happens to it. So we have to really sort of all work to close that circle up.